You always had this itch to build a company or to be an entrepreneur.
I mean, when I was in second grade, I started designing logos for my companies. People would say, "What is that?" I would say it was my trademark. They'd say, "What's the company going to do?" I'd say, "I don't know." The fastest way to wealth is entrepreneurship. And I don't say it's for everyone.
When you went into it, what was the tipping point when you made the leap?
And I was worried if I got a good job, I would get lulled into staying. I just told my wife while we're still dating, when we get married, I'm just letting you know, I'm only going to work for someone else for 2 years. And at exactly 2 years, I'm going to start a company. I worked for Coopers and Lybrand, which was, one of the big consulting firms at the time. I was really doing well. And it was kind of happening, right? Where it was like, if I just stayed another 8 years, I could be a partner. And I just had that clock, running. And I had this kind of mark on the calendar. I mean, I got to be honest with you, it felt really bad, right? It was just like, you could be the first person to write a program that did X. And so I started writing programs that were design aids for structural engineers. So I was as far as I know, I was the first person to write a program that would design a concrete steel reinforced retaining wall. So it wasn't the greatest, but it was the first. And so people were using it and I got a lot of really good feedback on it. And I felt like this could be a company. I was in Boston presenting at a conference and someone came up to me and said, "I work for a federal agency. We're having a major kind of goat rope of a project. Would you want to come in and take a look at it for us?" And so I did that, but millions of dollars had been spent on something that never would have worked. It was a total disaster.
How did your mind start to change around the way you viewed the future once post the first company exit?
I am deeply depressed. Going from kind of working this amazing mission to not, left this kind of void in my life. And yeah, there was definitely a time where I said to my wife, I want to undo this transaction. Is there a way we can undo it? Which of course there wasn't.
Adam, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Max, thanks for having me.
You are a guy that I follow on X, Twitter, like a lot of people that I ask on, and somebody that does a lot of interesting things. And I had to call you beforehand, which I don't always do for these, just because there's so many ways we could take it. You've done just a bunch of different types of entrepreneurial pursuits and different companies. And I feel like this is one where I'm so conflicted because there's so many interesting avenues I could take it down. And I'll just have to pick some and kind of roll with it. But real quickly, I mean, just high level background for people that don't know you, and then we'll launch off.
Okay, cool. So, my name's Adam Rossi. I live right outside of Washington, D.C. with a wife and 3 kids. I am a structural engineer who got into the world of software and started a company when I was 24. And then have sold that in 2010 and now do investing in startups, equities, real estate, manufacturing, whatever keeps me off the streets.
Yeah, it's part of me wants to just start this off with some of just I feel like you got a lot of wisdom in your tweets, and it's things that some of it going through the entrepreneurial journey myself, it's things that I really relate to. Your stuff about being a dad and having 3 kids, I've got 3 kids. I relate to that a lot. And just this stuff about these different companies that you've built. But one thing that we talked about when we had a brief discussion was that you always had this itch to build a company or to be an entrepreneur. I'm just wondering, as someone who I have 3 young boys and I'm trying to give them good advice as they get older. My oldest is still 9, so he's got a little bit of time, but just what is your thoughts and advice to young men or women that have that itch like you had, that maybe are kind of at either the beginning of their career or about to launch their career? Just some general advice. We'd just love to hear your take on it, since you've done it not once, but in multiple different industries.
I think for a lot of folks, they just don't have any exposure to business ownership or entrepreneurship. And so they think that's for someone else. And I think half the battle is just knowing that it's an option for you and knowing that you can do it, even if you're not connected or come from money, or, you know what I mean? It's something that I was very fortunate that my grandfather owned a construction company. My father owned a construction company. I grew up with trucks with the name, SC Rossi on the side of them. And even though we were, pretty well destitute because every dollar we made went back into the company, um, I worked for my father since I was a kid, and it just kind of felt natural to want to start a business. And so for that, I'm very thankful because I never went through that kind of, can I do this? It was almost more like, this is what someone does when they, when they mature. But when I talk to a lot of young folks, I try to do a lot of mentoring, coaching. Um, there's a lot of people that just say that have not had that family experience and say, "Oh, that's not for someone like me." And what I just try to say is, if you can get over that hurdle first, I think unless you're born with a family wealth source, I think the fastest way to wealth is entrepreneurship. And um, I don't say it's for everyone, but I do say for those folks that are willing to put the work and sacrifice in to make it happen and that have that burning desire, it can be absolutely attainable. And the advice I give is practical advice of, try to work for 2 years, save as much as you can, give yourself as much of a cushion as you can, network like crazy, and reach out and ask folks that are in the same industry, how did you do it? And they would be shocked at how charitable people will be to say, hey, I'm going to help you start a business in my industry. Um, and then just really be prepared for, uh, getting through the tough years of kind of cash flow. And if they can make it through that, they're well on their way.
A lot of interesting things there. I think this idea that it's in some ways it's yes, it's risky depending on what you want to do. Obviously, if it's a high capex business, then sure it could be very risky. But I think a lot of people exaggerate the risk that they have by doing it. And what I've found is that in some ways it's less risky. I mean, if you've got one boss at one company and you put in all this time there, I mean, anything could happen. You're kind of at the mercy of this one entity, or your boss changes, or the company gets restructured, and all your eggs are in that basket. Versus if you've got a business, maybe you've got multiple clients, or I don't know. In a lot of ways, like once you do it, you're kind of like, is this really riskier? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I think your practical advice around getting some experience, saving some money, and then giving yourself a runway is huge because it doesn't take that much success, then you can kind of build on it. And so just like when you went into it, what was the catalyst that made you say, all right, I'm going to switch from, I think you told me you went and got an MBA, and then you kind of went and did your own thing. You can react to any of that stuff I just said, but also want to hear kind of the tipping point when you made the leap.
Yeah, I think the one of the things that worked for me, and I think it helps. It's helpful when you're young to start a business, right? So, when my wife and I started our company, she continued to work. So I think a young married couple have like the ultimate ability to start a business. She was able to keep working. We could pay the bills. We lived beyond frugally. I mean, just junky, Toyota Camry and a crummy apartment. And that's where I would sit there at the kitchen table and write the software at first. And we didn't have kids at the time. We had almost no practical expenses. And so the risk was very low, right? I mean, if we put, 2 years into it, 3 years, whatever, and it didn't work out, well, I could have just went back and got a job, right? I mean, it wasn't the end of the world. Uh, So that's what I think. I agree with you that the risk, we go into this with clear eyes. We know that most small businesses don't make it to through the first year, then the fifth year mark, but it's not as incredibly risky as some people paint it. I think a lot of folks fail because they're undercapitalized. They try something and then they just say, "Okay, I can't make payroll the third month," and they just have to quit, right? So I think if your personal spend is very low and you have the mindset that I might fail, and that's okay. I'm not gonna, put tons of pressure on myself. Obviously, it's harder if you have, a bunch of kids and a big mortgage, and you have that intense pressure. I don't know if I could have dealt with that when we first started. Just that feeling of, if I mess this up, we're gonna have to move out of the house or something. So, yeah, I mean, I think, and then the other kind of superpower that young people have is they can work like the devil, right? They can, I mean, I was working 20 hours a day, and I was kind of artificially, um, uh, like goosing the revenue of a one person company, because I was a machine, I was cranking workout, and I couldn't do that at 51 years old now. Like, I need more sleep. Instead of 4 hours, I need 8 hours. And, so anyways, I think for young people that are interested in entrepreneurship, I hope they don't wait too long in life is another kind of point I would make.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, I think you're just describing exactly, I mean, almost to the T what I went through. I mean, I had a job and then there was a reorg and I got let go and my career had been on this like really upward trajectory. And then it just kind of out of necessity started doing some consulting. And then one thing led to another. And I was lucky to have a really good network, which you
Mm,
mentioned, and had good mentors, which is huge. And my wife had a job with health insurance. We had
mm.
yet to have kids yet. um, 6 months in, we did have kids, or we were a kid on the way. And my industry is like the prices had crashed to a generational bear market, which was a little scary, but we figured it out. And I think it was just that was like the perfect time, because to your point, it would have been way harder to do it later on in life when you have all these other pressures and demands and three kids and sports every other night and all these bills to pay. It would be harder for me. So I think like there is kind of like a Goldilocks spot there that most people maybe just pass over on that and they don't try it then, and then it just gets harder in some ways. I mean, you learn more and you gain wisdom as you get older, but at the same time, life changes. To your point, you don't have as much energy, have more risk with these other responsibilities. So that is kind of like a really good time in life. But was it a conscious thing where you're like, I'm going to set out to do this? Or was there a catalyst where you just had to do it? Like in my instance, I was like, I got to do something. I can either apply for a new job or I can just go and try to make this happen. And then when you started doing it, I saw a tweet that you did and said it was lonely and you were just grinding away. What were some of the other, like, yeah, just dealing with the uncertainty, the loneliness, all those things when you finally made that decision?
Yeah, so what I did was I was really worried, because I had it in my mind that I was going to start a company. I mean, when I was in second grade, I started designing logos for my companies. People would say, "What is that?" I would say it was my trademark. They'd say, "What's the company going to do?" I'd say, "I don't know." I had this burning wish and desire, and I was worried if I got a good job, I would get lulled into staying. So I just told my wife while we are still dating, so my girlfriend at the time, when we get married, I'm just letting you know, I'm only going to work for someone else for 2 years. And at exactly 2 years, I'm going to start a company. And she was like, great, let's do it. And so I worked for Coopers and Lybrand, which was, one of the um, big consulting firms at the time. And I was writing software, and I was learning a lot of bid and proposal work, which was really great experience. And it was Coopers and Lybrand at the time was really odd in that it was highly disorganized, and so a young kind of new employee, if they raised their hand, could take on a lot of authority. And so over those 2 years, I started really, I was really doing well, and it was kind of happening, right, where it was like, man, I'm making all this money, and if I just stayed another like 8 years, I could be a partner. And I just had that clock, running, and I had this kind of mark on the calendar. And when the calendar hit, I mean, I got to be honest with you, it felt really bad, right? It was just like, I was like, oh man, I've made a promise to myself. I have to do this. I went in and I told the partner that I worked for, I'm I'm quitting to start my own software company. And it was a negative discussion, and that he was just like, I think you were doing really well here, and you're going to regret this. And I just said, I'm sorry. I made a promise to myself and I have to do this now. He said, just wait a little while, maybe give it another year. Maybe you'll change. You know what I mean? And I had to stick to that promise. So yeah, it was just, it's one of those things where I've talked to a lot of folks and they're like, I had the same feeling when I was, that age, and I got into a good job and it was rewarding, but I've always for 20, 30 years had in the back of my mind, what if I had just done it, taken the leap? And they have this feeling of regret. And so I'm glad I kind of committed, or I might be that guy right now.
Yeah. It's really, I found it's like not super productive most of the time to tell people about something you're going to go and start or do. Like when it comes to a business, it's just the negative feedback that you get. And there's a lot of different reasons I think people give it. I think sometimes if it's loved ones, like I remember my dad being nervous about it and he's like, I'm just worried about you with doing this, and it's like they've got a motivation. If it's people in your industry or former boss or colleagues, maybe there's a piece of them that's like, they were too afraid to do it, and they think that
Yeah.
they're smarter than you for not. They're like, "Oh, I picked the smart path by going, the safe route." But just in general, like it's like telling people an idea for a baby name. You're just gonna get bad. Oh, I hate that name. You know what I mean? It's like don't. It's like almost like don't tell anyone, or like if you do tell people, be very guarded and go to like people that are mentors or people that you trust, because it just seems like people find reasons to tell you not to do it, or at least that's been my experience on different things that I've done.
I mean, the feedback for me was overwhelmingly negative, and you wouldn't think it would be if your family has entrepreneurs, but I think, you know, my parents had 4 kids and they saw me working in a, major metropolitan area, Washington DC, with a fancy job, and I think they felt that I was too young and too inexperienced, and yeah, they were saying the same thing. Why don't you just give it a couple more years? You've got this great job. What if it doesn't work for, you know what I mean? They gave negative feedback. My friends gave uh, negative feedback, and I think what the issue is, for most people, entrepreneurship is a big leap. And if you think back to the late 90s, kind of startups and entrepreneurship were not cool then. So I think there was also just there was a feeling of like, you know, hey man, this is really, really risky and there's a high risk of failure. And if you fail, you're going to be embarrassed and, you're going to be bankrupt and all these other things. I think society has gotten a little better in that regard, and that, we now don't really, um, it's more like, oh, they tried and it didn't work, but that's cool, which is, I think, a much better mindset. But yeah, man, I think, the funny thing is I've done the same thing in that I've never tried to talk someone out of entrepreneurship, but someone has told me their idea, their concept, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, I don't know about that. And then you go on and they're a huge success, right? So it's like, I'm glad you didn't listen to me because, you know, your mind, I think, it's human negativity bias, right? We are wired to find the negative threats and not to think of the positives. And it happens to all of us to some degree.
For sure. Well, how did it go from, I think you said maybe that it was originally like software for engineers and then it transformed into what became, from all that you've told me, it sounds like a very successful business, and that went on for a long period of time and that you eventually exited. But what was the turnover point and how did you evolve? Because this seems to be a theme in a lot of successful entrepreneurs where they have a thesis or an idea, but this ability to kind of roll with the punches and never be, you don't want to be wishy-washy, but at the same time, you got to figure out like, what am I doing? Is it working? And then if a new opportunity presents itself, it's kind of like the point.
Yeah. So I think it's important for, for younger people that don't kind of know what the, mid to late 90s were like, that it was still within kind of this computing, uh, like revolution. You could be the first person to write a program that did X. And so I started writing programs that were design aids for structural engineers. So I was as far as I know, I was the first person to write a program that would design a concrete steel reinforced retaining wall, and draw, based on the soil dimensions and height and water pressure, kind of, okay, the wall needs to be this thick at the top, this thick at the bottom. You got to put the steel here, and it would draw and kind of line art, like a plan for an engineer. And, so it wasn't the greatest, but it was the first. And so people were using it, and I got a lot of really good feedback on it. And I felt like this could be a company, I can just keep doing that. And what I found was the customer acquisition. This was still pre-internet. I mean, there were websites, but people weren't really, kind of advertising a lot. There was no SEO. There was kind of traditional like magazines and things, but customer acquisition for engineers, for me at least, proved very difficult. It was like, where do you find them? There's association of engineers. You can, send flyers. You can talk. But I was, I was having trouble uh, acquiring customers in that space. And so one of the things I did was I said, okay, I'm young. I look super young. I look like, a teenager at the time. I felt like I had a credibility issue. And so I said, okay, I'm going to start writing a bunch of articles in programming magazines. I'll be a speaker at any software development conference that'll have me. And I'll show people that, I am a professional software engineer, and try to kind of market through that channel. And one of the things that happened was I was in Boston presenting at a conference, and someone came up to me and said, hey, you said you're from DC. I work for a federal agency. We're having a major kind of goat rope of a project. Would you want to come in and take a look at it for us? And so I did that. And it was a monster. I mean, it was, millions of dollars had been spent on something that never would have worked. It was a total disaster. And so I said, look, this isn't where my heart is, but I'll put my, kind of engineering programming on hold, and I'll do this and kind of bail you out. They had a deadline, at the end of the year. I said, if I work kind of every day for the next 6 months, I can get this done by myself by the end of the year. We got to start over. And they're like, okay, do it. And so I did that, delivered it. All the agents, field agents loved it. And I just went on my way, and I kept doing my thing. And a random kind of occurrence, there was a bagel shop in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, suburb of DC. And I ran into a guy that worked for that agency, and he said, hey, my manager's been looking for you. We really like that thing. The people out in the field like it. Would you come back and help us do this other thing? And that kind of chance meeting was the kind of domino that fell, and eventually I pivoted my entire business towards that customer base.
It's interesting because it's like they talk about the different types of luck, and you put yourself, so people might listen to that story and say it was lucky, but I saw lots of dots that were connected along the way that got you to that luck. And it's like this idea that you were going to go off on your own, you were going to hone your skills, working 20-hour days, learn to be a subject matter expert in something that was emerging. You then had to figure out, okay, how do I find distribution? So you leaned into the networking thing, which was going to these conferences and doing this stuff. And you never know what's going to happen from that. Like I've always said
Yep.
that conferences and networking or podcasting or whatever is always like this jagged line. Like it may not be directly like, hey, I went here for this reason, but then something totally different opportunity falls in your lap from meeting these people. And then after that, the luck started coming to you. You were creating your own luck because you had done something, you became an expert, or you did a good job. And now the opportunities just started flowing towards you. And it's like so many, even though that's a unique story, I feel like so many things in life kind of follow a similar pattern to what you just described. And it's hard to see it when you haven't lived through it, but what you're saying, I'm like, that makes total sense. Like I don't know. To me, that just seems like a logical thing that happens to people that are smart, work hard, put themselves in the right position.
I think you're right. I think it's one of those things where the the things that I was doing were so maniacal Like, I would win. Remember back in the day, you'd listen to, like, a rock radio station late at night, and they would say, "Hey, we have Ozzy Osbourne tickets," and, like, the first caller gets, 2 tickets to Ozfest or whatever. I would win those tickets all the time because 'cause I'd be, like, the only guy awake at, 3:30, pulling my hair out, like, trying to figure out this new internet technology, and I would win the tickets, and I'd just never go get them. I was just be like, "I don't have time to go to Ozfest," you know? Um, but I was like an arrow flying towards this thing where I was just saying, "I'm gonna be the best in the world at this kind of technology, and I'm going to try to get the word out there that, I'm doing these things, and hopefully, potential customers and employees will gravitate towards that." But, it's this it is a leap of faith in that you're I mean, the first unless you some people are smart and that they'll start a business and they immediately pick up customers from their previous job. I wish I'd had that because I mean, the first for me, the first year, just customer acquisition, I would just say, okay, if I'm not doing this for pay, I'm just going to do it to learn it. Um, and yet there were some really, really scary times where you can get shaken out if you just say, all right, I tried. Nobody wanted this stuff. I give up. That was never an option for me. And like I said, man, I had this amazing gift in that my wife was employed and, I wasn't like running out of food and she was patient and she would say, it's okay. Like, they didn't want it or, but you'll get them next time. And so, yeah, I think it's just people that work on themselves and their skills and their craft, they'll eventually find the luck and the place. And I've seen other stories where people pivoted in ways that are just amazing, right? I mean, they were doing something, the market wasn't there, they pivoted and became huge successes. So yeah, I think it's luck, I think it's patience, I think it's, setting yourself up so that you have the time to figure it out and you don't say, "All right, I've got 3 months of cash, like if this doesn't work, I'm done."
Yeah. The maniacal focus thing, I can relate with that. My business partners always said that in some ways can be my greatest gift and my, it's like it can be the best thing and the worst thing about my attention. It's like he's like, "Man, you get so laser focused on stuff. It's like you get tunnel visioned on it." But then this other thing you mentioned about I think a big part of this stuff is just do. I mean, people
Yeah,
just
yeah.
get so caught up in planning and thinking about it. It's just like, just start doing. And you're going to find out real quick whether it's at a job or whether it's starting a company, whether you like it, whether you're good at it, whether you want to whether you enjoy it. So half of the battle sometimes is just like being that arrow, like you said, that's just hurtling towards something. The trajectory can always change, but if you're not moving, if you're just in place, then you're never going to get to like anywhere basically.
Yeah, I remember at the time I did it, everyone said, "Well, you got to have a business plan, and you have to put a lot of effort into it." And and so I did a business plan, and it was totally worthless. And but you can see someone just saying, "Oh, well, I got negative feedback on my business plan. Maybe I should try this another 6 months." It's like, no, just do something. Talk to people that may or may not be customers. Try something. Get out there. I think it's also a fault I see with some startups because funding has been relatively easy compared to when I started. Funding for startups is much easier today. They'll raise a decent amount of cash and they'll start just doing stuff without ever putting it in front of customers or getting market validation. And they're kind of like, yeah, they're doing something, but they're not really like doing the entire uh, they're not doing everything that's required to really have a sustainable business, and then they run out of money and they're like, okay, well, we tried. And it's like, I don't, yeah, you tried, you started like writing code or building something, but you didn't get out in the world. That's the other thing is it's just like, if you can keep talking to customers, I have a lot of faith that you're going to figure it out. If you're just, doing something behind closed doors, I don't have a lot of faith.
Yeah. It's this it's like you're a solution in search of a problem type of thing. I think that's the
Yeah.
right way to say it. But Yeah, it's like if you can make those incremental steps and then get that validation, you're heading in the right direction. So then how did it evolve? I mean, basically got a few of these contracts. Walk me through because we there's so many things we could talk about. Uh, that just like kind of the high level, like what were the step changes in that business where you kind of hit these next levels and got to where eventually you sold it. But just walk me through the evolution of it.
Yeah, it is funny that, people always tell you, there's these inflection points in a business like 10 people, 50 people, or revenue steps, and it really is like a chunky step, right? It's never a smooth. Yeah. And so for me, the first couple years were really slow in that I probably hired my first employee at like year 2, and maybe my second employee at year 3. It was at first it was really, really slow. And I was deathly afraid of not being able to make payroll. And um, I was also a control freak and would micromanage kind of every line that someone else wrote. And you know, if you look at a graph, like my first couple years were like, subsistence. And we eventually got up to either 10 or 12 people. And I did feel like that was a big kind of point where it was like, okay, now we're writing significant software. This is a real team. We've got people that are now kind of, but we were all still software developers. And, you know, we reached a point where finally, I was like, I think we've spent way too much time getting to this point. I'm clearly not doing some things that are right. And I was spending too much time, like I just said, behind the office door. So I had a discussion with my wife. She was working for Accenture or Anderson Consulting. I can remember it was Anderson or Accenture at the time, but she was like, okay, we've reached a point where this is a going concern. She quit her job, came over and took on, kind of the operational role of the company. And I said, I have to get out there and spend all my time with our customer base. I need to represent the company. I need to gather what they want, gather the requirements, um, be selling, And so I told my team, I'm not writing any more software. I'm going to go do this. And people were like, this is insane. Um, but when we made that switch, the company just kind of shot up to like the 50 person mark. Like it was, we started taking like really chunky stair steps up, and it would be like, I remember a point where, um, I heard somebody like a new hire orientation, and they're like, hey, the good thing about working here is next year you'll be more senior than half the people in the company. Because we were just on that like trajectory. And, we were opening different offices. And I mean, there was a surreal moment for me where we had an office in Clarksburg, West Virginia, to be near a, a, a federal law enforcement customer out there. And the I heard a guy at the office say, oh, I got to check with corporate, meaning our office here in the DC area in Northern Virginia. And I was like, would you just say corporate? Like, okay, we're not really, that type of company, but it started to feel really weird when we started getting into like the 100, 150, 200 person, 250 person mark. And you would see people that you weren't personally involved in selecting, right? It'd just be like a new person showing up. But yeah, it was kind of like 10 person, 50 person, probably like 100 or 150. And then we really at that point had, I felt like we could have scaled up to $1 billion company with thousands of employees with kind of the team we had.
And it was so this is like in the security space. What was changing in that over time? What led to and what was changing in it? How were you able to be successful as it changed? And then what was the point when you're like, I'm gonna exit this thing? Because that's a big decision.
Yeah.
It's a huge decision. I did it recently with the company, and it was like it's a major, major life thing that is some ways it's great because you're going to sell the company, but in other ways it's scary because it's what you've poured your life into.
Yeah. So, our company would write, mainly we were known as a tools developer for law enforcement and intelligence, federal agencies. Um, so offensive, defensive cyber tools, evidence collection systems, code breaking. We were kind of known as, if you had a real problem in the real world and you needed a solution to it quickly, we were the team to do that. And, our competitors were by and large kind of large, publicly traded companies. So, slower, not as nimble, not as high skill. Um, and so, and, this is against the backdrop of uh, 9/11 and um, Iraq and Afghanistan and a bunch of uh, kind of worldwide operations for a bunch of different agencies. And so, we were for years kind of in the, you know, I say like we were running and gunning. We were like, we're going to catch bad guys. We're going to help this mission. We're going to, we're going to do what it takes. We're working with people who are totally committed to this thing. Um, and it was really exhilarating. And, in 2010, I was 39 years old and I didn't think I'd ever sell my company. But, we were in this like kind of the mission went so long, too long in my opinion, that a lot of the people that we were working with were kind of phoning it in and just it felt like it became very bureaucratic and legalistic and slower and the amount of plus we grew as a company and so just the amount of like BS reports and audits and just like stuff I just didn't care about. It just kept getting more and more, and I would say, man, a big company they have in-house legal counsel, they have a team of auditors, they have all these resources, um, and so my wife and I decided to look into you know what the market would kind of value a company like ours, and we immediately had just amazing interest and so yeah, so we sold, even though, you know, it was not, something I intended to do or necessarily wanted to do and, regretted after the fact. But, um, I think it was also, we had young kids and my wife was under a ton of pressure just like I was. We both worked in this business and it was a way for us to say, all right, like, let's not work like this while we raise these kids anymore. So I think those are the things that really went into it.
That's yeah, I relate to some of that for sure. The post that you posted recently around this idea of retiring and you could sell a company, make a big lick or enough money to where like you can kind of write your own future and don't have to be forced to do anything and you have all these ideas in your head about what that would feel like. Such a common story that I hear from guys like, we recently sold our company, but I've no friends that have sold billion-dollar companies and then they're like talking about all this stuff like I'm going to go and take up fly fishing and do all these things and then like sure enough 6 months later
Yeah.
they're doing their next company. Um just talk through that a little bit because I think it's something that it's a trap a lot of people fall into. I even think people fall into that trap around normal retirement as well.
hmm
But just, how was that for you when that happened? And then how did your mind start to change around the way you viewed the future once post the first company exit?
Yeah. Um, it was one of those things where everything everyone told me came true and that, people warned me, hey man, I know it sounds great to get a bunch of money, but I suffered from a lot of depression and, you know, uh, and I would hear people say that and I'd be like, you gotta be kidding me, man. Like you were depressed. Like why you won? Um, and then it happened to me, it was just like, I am deeply depressed. I feel like, um, going from kind of working this amazing mission to not, left this kind of void in my life. And um, yeah, there was definitely a time where I said to my wife, like, I want to undo this transaction. Like, is there a way we can undo it? Which, of course, there wasn't. But I think the concept that we work our ass off and then retire does seem stupid, right? I mean, even if it's a regular 9 to 5, where it's like, I'm going to forego travel and spending time with my family because I'm going to work really hard. Then I'm going to, finally retire or exit, and then I'll do all that stuff. And a lot of people do that, at a very advanced age. They don't have their health anymore, and they can't do a lot of that stuff, right? Or the moments pass, the kids are older, they're out of the house, they don't want to hang out with you anymore. I mean, it just, I think it's kind of a scam, this whole like idea of retirement. And so, I knew for me, I had to get back into things that were interesting. I just couldn't do it 20 hours a day anymore. So I purposely tried to buy companies. I did buy companies that would not require hundreds of employees like my previous company. So, kind of $1 million per employee or higher kind of revenue to headcount. Um, and I wanted to have a more flexible schedule so that I could coach my kids' basketball team and go on the high adventure campouts and do those things with my family. And so, I was able to kind of get out of the depression by doing those things. I know some people that some people that have exited who are like, I love surfing and I'm going to surf for 300 days out of the year. And they do that and they love it. I've just never loved a hobby like that. Like, my hobby is business. I love business, And so I knew for me, like, all right, retirement is not like skiing and surfing. And, I like doing that stuff, but not, I got to do something else and it's got to be related to business.
When you learn these things too, like you mentioned this thing around not having as many employees, revenue per head count, how do you gain the most amount of leverage and without getting the most amount of your time dedicated to something? And as you get more seasoned as an entrepreneur, at least in my view, I felt like it stops becoming how do I make money versus like what's my, because if you look around the world, you could like I could go mow someone's yard, I could go mow yards and make money. It's like it's not
Yeah.
about making money. Like you could, there's tons of things we could go do. It's about like what do I love to do? What's interesting to me? What's the trade-offs around my time? Things like that. And you almost start to have to high grade opportunities, so just like your thoughts on how you've high graded them. You've also talked a lot about venture stuff and investing in things, just thoughts about how that initial push in that company and then the post all of that, your thoughts around business and investing and how that's evolved.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's natural for folks that exit to gravitate towards some sort of startup investing. We want to work with other founders. We want to give back to some degree. And so I've done that kind of throughout. I've actually, recently said I need to slow down on it because it is a big time commitment and it's not often financially rewarding. But I do think, the natural progression when someone exits is, okay, I'm going to become an investor. I'm going to invest in startups. I'm going to work with, young companies. And I think that's cool. Um, but I think uh, you're right. Like, you have to jealously guard your time, high grade the hell out of everything, because you can get sucked into a bunch of things that you feel are obligations, and you can be working just as hard as you ever did before you exited on just a bunch of shit, really, like that you're not, it started to happen to me a little bit before I really understood kind of how I should be spending my time, where, you say yes to a bunch of boards and, you know, startups and you're kind of like, okay, I'm too busy to go get the oil changed in my car. Like, how did this happen? Like, and I remember family members saying, "Didn't you sell your company? Like, why are you so busy?" And it's just like, yeah, it's kind of sneaking up on me again. You got to say no to so much when you have that flexibility of money and time, because it'll get taken up like, you know, immediately if you let it.
Yeah. I've had to really try to push myself to try to be more passive or investing or putting, I've always had this like lean towards wanting to have my finger on the scale with whatever I put my money into.
Hmm.
It's like I want to start this thing and I want to be involved. And I've done like a little bit of interest stuff. And to your point, it's like most of the time that money's just money I'm never going to see. It's like, okay, cool. I just like paid for an education in this type of business, and
Hmm.
I learned about what not to do. Um, but now as I'm getting a little older, I'm trying to get better at being more passive and saying, there's a lot of power in having maybe some high conviction bets and then being like just letting it ride. And there's, like one thing I know you and I share a common interest in is Bitcoin. And I've got into it about 5 years ago and made a relatively high conviction bet there and have kind of rode the ups and downs. And then seeing the power of that, and you're like, okay, well, if you do some things or put some money into things that are passive that you believe in, there's also power there too. I've just never been like a stock investing guy, or like the Bitcoin thing even was pretty out of characteristic for me, because I've always just wanted to control things. But I don't know, just your thoughts on that type of stuff, and then we can parlay that in a little bit about Bitcoin and why you think it's interesting too, because I think I always like connecting with people on that front.
Yeah, so I think that I'm like you, and that even if I'm investing in a public equity, I wanna, I'll call into the analyst day. I'll link into the, management team and you know, try to control things because we're just wired that way, right? Like, okay, why, if and I think you can cause yourself a lot of frustration, right? I mean, if you there's all this discussion on X, for example, now about like what is passive income really, like owning multifamily and renting, like that's not passive, right? It's a lot of work. And there's all these activities that I do where I say, okay, I love this business. It doesn't make me a lot of money. I spend a lot of time on it. This other thing I give no time and commitment to, and it's made, a 10x compared to the first investment. Um, I think when it comes to working with younger companies and investing in them, they can be incredible time sinks. And I think you're right in that not you need to, but what I've found that I need to do is find good founders, make an investment. If they ask for, something, obviously, respond with that, but not try to um, become super active in it or do less of that. And I think there's a a feeling that we have where we must take action on things, and a lot of times, no matter what we do, it's not really going to change the outcome. Like, I'm a worrier at night. I'll lay there and worry about stuff that is so far beyond my control. It is laughable. And then in the morning, I'm like, why did I rob myself of 2 hours worrying about shit that I can't possibly control the outcome of? But we're just wired that way. It's like, well, but maybe if I can figure out and so,
Yeah, you were
yeah,
the
I think,
guy. My wife says you were the guy to me because I did the same thing. She's like, they would stay awake at night and guard the village thousands of years ago. It's like that's when your
yes.
brain starts to kind of like there's something hardwired about that at nighttime. Why does it all spool up then? When during the day, I don't even think about it.
Oh God, yes. I mean, just I also have a lot of dreams, and uh I'll find myself kind of trying to work through scenarios and things in a dream, even though it's in a weird way, but it's like the brain is constantly working on countering threats or um you know preparing for something that may or may not happen. Uh and sometimes I think it's beneficial, right? I mean, so when I was writing a lot of software, we were working on algorithms that could be devilishly tricky to program and program efficiently. And, I can remember many times where I would have, you know, a module that was thousands of lines of code, and yet it wasn't running fast enough, or it wasn't doing what it needed to do because we were processing, large amounts of data and trying to do things to it. And so I would then kind of go to sleep, take a shower, jog in the morning, and I would just see it. It's like my brain had been working on it in the background, and I was like, "Oh my god, I've wasted all that time. Like this algorithm can be rewritten this way." And it worked so much better. So I think there's benefit to having a brain that like won't shut the fuck up and leave you alone. But but man, it can also be uh hard to live with.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. So on these other businesses, you bought them or was it your idea? Because I look at the different, it's like now you're doing this ballistic shield
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
You mentioned you do some e-commerce, you've done some real estate stuff. Is this things that you went and acquired into it, or were any of them like your brainchild that you seeded and did it yourself, or just a little bit on the current stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix of all of those. I mean, I felt like the demographics of our country were shifting older, and I said, okay, I really want to own a assisted living facility, but I want to own the best one that's ever been built. The nicest one, the best standard of care, and so I found some partners. We bought a piece of raw land and went all the way through kind of the medical rezoning and the building and the staffing and learned a ton about kind of that industry. The company you mentioned, Total Shield, that makes the ballistic stuff, was a 20-year-old company created by a engineer out of Sandia National Laboratory who was ready to retire. So I bought that one. Fascinating business, working mainly with space companies. So it's just a mix of. I mean, I definitely will buy or start, but going back to that metric we talked about before, um, I do not. I found that one of the things about me is I don't want to manage a large number of employees. So I look at a lot of great businesses, but they're just employee heavy, and I always say no to them. I just say, I know myself. I'm not the greatest when it comes to like. I mean, for someone that can manage thousands of employees, my hat's off to them because I'm not that guy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. There's all kinds of problems, but people problems are complex. They're tough. They're tough ones to deal with. You could maybe, I mean, I know you do this off grid cabin deal. We've talked about how popular that is on social media. That would probably, those types of projects would probably crush on a short term rental side of things. Just people love this idea of like simple off grid living. How'd you tackle that problem? What are some of the challenges there? And has it been surprising, like how popular that is online?
It's fascinating to me how much people are into that online. Like this morning, I wrote an article on um, regulations and the need to deregulate, and like 10 people will look at it. But if I if I post something about um, the concrete vault that I put in the ground that has all my batteries for my off grid um, energy storage, people are like, talk about that. I'm really interested in that. I think there's this movement of people wanting to get back to nature, back to agriculture, back to the wilderness. That's very strong. I don't know what it's probably some sort of cyclical thing society goes through where nobody cares about that stuff, and then we rediscover it. Like I remember, I was born in 73, so I wasn't, exactly in like the hippie phase, but I remember, you know, growing up, there were like a lot of communes, right? People wanted to go back to nature and learn how to like milk a cow. And I grew up on a farm. So it was, um, it was surprising to me. It is surprising to me how much people are into that right now. I mean, I did it just because, I was lucky enough during the great financial crisis to buy 550 acres on the Shenandoah River, totally unencumbered by uh, what is it called, where it's locked up for uh, you can't develop it. Conservation easement. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Conservation easement. There were no conservation easements on it. So at the time, I mean, I think it was, maybe still is, like the largest parcel on the Shenandoah River that was totally, raw timberland, and yet no conservation easements. Like I could do what I wanted. And so the only bad thing was, like, it was too far away from power. I talked to Rappahannock Power, and they said, yeah, you're not going to get any power over there. So I had to kind of figure all that stuff out of, um, wiring up the inverters and the solar panels, and then, you know, um, cutting down wood and milling it and building a cabin. And I did all that stuff. I still do it. My wife feels like I spend too much time on it, but I did it just because I love building stuff and figuring stuff out. And I feel like, even though people say like, oh, you have a degree in structural engineering, it's like, yeah, that doesn't help me figure out how to like mill a piece of wood and put it, like those skills I learned on YouTube, like I can open up a book on, log cabin building, or watch a video and go out there and do all this stuff. And it's like my little world, I mean, I built a pond. I built a tree house that's crazy that overlooks the river. Um, uh, we have a greenhouse that we grow citrus fruit in, like in the winter, which is really cool here in Virginia. Um, I'm going to plant a bunch of ginseng this week on this mountain slope that I have. So for me, it's fun stuff. I should probably share it more, but it's funny because you're like me in that you'll post whatever you want, and it's on a lot of different things. I think people get confused with me because one day I'm talking about, you know, milling wood for a cabin, and another day I'm talking about, you know, programming or something. It's Mine is a confusing account just like yours, but that's the stuff I'm into and I don't care.
Well, it's authentic. I mean, I think that's why I gravitate towards it. I mean, yes, there are accounts I follow that it's like, hey, you're a whatever oil price guy, and I want to know what's going on with oil prices, so I follow this account. But there's other people that I follow just 'cause I think it's interesting, and you've done a lot of interesting things. I think what's funny about the off grid stuff is most people, it's like they like it on Instagram, but to really go to the links that you went to, they probably wouldn't. And I feel like with the projects we've done with our short term rentals, it's like we really cater to like the Dallas, North Texas market because that's pretty much everybody that goes there. And it's like they want this idea of being like out in nature, but they also want like a really luxury like house or whatever that they can just hang out and like have all the comforts of, this giant cool cabin. So it's cool that you're actually doing it because I think a lot of people kind of romanticize the outdoor living thing or the off-grid living thing, and then they just want to like look at it out the window in their nice comfy place that they stay in. I don't know.
You're 100% right. I mean, I beg people. I just had this conversation with a guy yesterday on DMs. I say, is there any way you can get power? And he's like, well, yeah, there's power 700 yards away, but I'm thinking about just doing it off grid like you did. And I'm like, don't do it. Get power. Be grid tied, man. Like, sure, do some solar, save some, like, but being grid tied is a amazing luxury. And to be really, really, really off grid is so freaking hard, like, and yeah, you don't, your person that's staying at, a short-term rental wants to be able to use a hair dryer. You cannot use a hair dryer at my property, like that hair dryer will run down my entire system, in like 15 minutes if it's just left on. I mean, like, and so, then people are calling and saying, why is the power out? It's like, well, because it's a cloudy day and you ran a space heater or whatever. Like, I can't do that. So yeah, it looks great when you're chopping wood and putting it in a wood stove and looks cozy and romantic, and it is, but like, when it's raining and it's freezing and you ran out of wood and you need to go there and chop more, you're like, this sucks.
My learning lesson on off grid is that we did a Bitcoin mining company, and it was our thesis was it's all off grid. We would generate our own power. We would, produce the natural gas, generate our own power, and build our own data centers, which we nerded out and rented like warehouse space and built them ourselves because it was too expensive to buy the ones that were pre-made. And after all of it, we were just like, we should have just like either bought Bitcoin or just like plugged it into the grid. Cause this was yeah, it would have been a little more expensive, but try to keep a generator running in the middle of Western Oklahoma where it's like a 2 hour drive away and you're like, the generator's down. You had to call somebody. But yeah, doing anything off grid, it sounds fun and cool and it might be cheaper, but ultimately there's a lot of trade offs there. But last thing here at the end, I mentioned Bitcoin earlier. What got you interested in it? I see you post a little bit about it, but it's such a polarizing topic for people. You seem like a smart, engineering minded guy, computer savvy, but just what gravitated you towards it, and what do you think about what's going on today and where it's kind of what's been happening recently with it?
The reason I'm cautious about talking too much about it is there are a lot of kind of nutty people out there that try to convince other people to, mortgage their house and put it all into Bitcoin. I don't want to um, lead people that maybe are impressionable to something that is a very volatile asset class, and they might not be able to stomach the drawdowns that we know happen in Bitcoin, right? So I don't talk about it a lot, but I do have a very high level of conviction, and the reason I do is, when because my company was deeply involved in cryptography, and I was, a student of like every NIST cryptography proposal, and I would, participate in a lot of the competitions that the government used to hold. Um, when I first saw the Bitcoin white paper, I was amazed at how comprehensive it was, and I felt like this is something that makes a lot of sense. I was not one of these people that went in, because even though I appreciated it from a technical perspective, it wasn't easy to buy, right? You could run a node and you could mine some big, but I was just kind of like, okay, I started to, accumulate some Bitcoin, but not obviously to the level that um, uh, a lot of people did. I was so early, but I didn't accumulate a lot until kind of later, a higher price point, whatever. The reason I truly am a believer in this as a reserve asset and will not sell the Bitcoin that I have is almost all related to the problem of being debanked or having a centralized authority that controls the financial network, having intermediaries. And I'm a law abiding citizen for the most part. Um, it's not like I feel like I am uh, a person that is in under imminent threat of being debanked, but I was targeted by this IRS contractor, Charles Littlejohn, during the Trump tax return hack, if you remember that. He stole my tax returns personally and my business tax returns and disseminated them with uh, news agencies and things like that. Um, you know, it, there's it's not a leap to think that any of us under a future system could be targeted as someone who is, saying things that are politically incorrect or doing something that would cause our assets to be frozen, cause our ability to transact to be curtailed somehow. It happens in other countries. I hope to God it never happens in the United States. But when I saw that this is like bars of gold, yet I can take them across country lines and I don't have to call my banker and ask permission or send a wire that goes through, 50 reviews. I said to myself, I don't care if the price of Bitcoin ever goes up. I'm not buying it as a speculative asset. I just want to have a portion of my net worth in an asset class like that gives me that ability to, or the flexibility to make those decisions without someone saying no. And so That's my thesis. And people that want to debate, you must hear it all the time too. Cause my personal friends, like I'm going to go to a party tonight and someone will probably say Bitcoin's worthless, if they hear me talk about it. Right. And I just always say, hold on, it's a highly secure worldwide network that allows me to exchange assets without an intermediary. Like that's worth something, right? It's not worth, to me, that's worth something. We could debate the price, but like I want to have that asset because it's the only thing that I have. If JP Morgan were to call me up and say, "Hey, Adam, bad news. We got hacked," or "You're on a list and you're a publicly exposed person and you're a politically exposed person. We can't let you transact." It's the only thing I have outside of the system.
Right. Great reasoning there. And honestly, to your point too, around I try not to convince people as well because it is volatile and everybody's got to make their own decisions on that front. But for me, it was I got fascinated with the energy side of it and the mining, and I was just like, wait a second, this is just the conversion of energy, and I just that really resonated because my whole career has been kind of like selling energy. That was my
Yeah.
business, and so my whole career I've been hyper focused on how do I maximize the value for selling energy, and then that immediately with Bitcoin, I was like, this can't be real, and then I started digging into the technology and started to understand all the things you mentioned about the network. There's absolutely value there, and the banking system is very cumbersome. I mean, I just want to move basic money around and you got to call the bank and then they got to do this and then you get over here and it's going to be multiple days till it shows up and then it's like there's just all these things and if it's too much money then you have to answer this questionnaire and it's
Hmm.
like and then all the KYC stuff they're leaking your information like you talked about and it's like every month we get a letter, every 6 months we get a letter. Your information's been leaked and blah, blah,
Yep.
blah. Here's a free year subscription to Norton Antivirus or whatever. And you're like, thanks, but been better
Yep.
if you just didn't leak my info. And so it's powerful. And until you like actually transact with it and, have a podcast editor who's in a different country and you can't Venmo them and you're like, do you take
Yeah.
Bitcoin? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, cool on my phone. Just like send it to them and they have it within 10 minutes. And it's like, there's just something really powerful there. So, just want to get your take on it. I respect your. I mean, you're clearly a smart guy who's been well accomplished and done a lot of things, and it's always good to hear somebody's perspective on it. But thanks for taking the time to do this, and you've obviously got a lot going on, and I've really enjoyed it. I don't know if you have anything to tell people around where they can. Some people are like, "Hey, find me here." If you have anything you want to tell them, but I mean, obviously you're on X, but anything else you want to tell the audience before we close it out?
No, I mean, I would say X is the best thing for me. And I try to, you know, answer any DMs that I receive. And, um, and I also will jump on a phone call. If someone wants advice on something or wants to chat about an idea or whatever, I walk every day. And so I like to take a couple phone calls and do that. But yeah, I feel the same way about you, Max. You're, um, I think have went down a similar path, and so I love watching what you're doing, and I appreciate you chatting with me today.
Well, thanks, Adam. Thank you, guys.